Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This episode is 234, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/234. And joining me for this episode, I have the managing editor at the Libertarian Institute and longtime friend Keith Knight. How's it going, man?
Zero complaints, Patrick. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate it, bud. And I wanted to have you on because I have a bit of an announcement to make. And the announcement is that this is the last episode of Liberty Weekly. But fear not, I'm not going anywhere. We're doing a rebrand of the show. So this will be the last Liberty Weekly. And the new show, it's titled Vital Dissent with Patrick McFarlane, will be starting next week. And actually, I'm going to start off with the next episode number. So it'll be 235. And the show notes will be, the new website is vitaldissent.com. And so you can find everything there. And the show notes should be live still for past episodes and things like that. So yeah, we're really excited about it. I'll be talking a bit more about that later. But in this episode, we are going to talk about an article that you put on the blog at the Institute, Keith. 13 Thomas Sowell quotes that destroyed progressivism. Is that the title?
I believe so. If you want to pull it on the screen, my memory is fading as we try to always keep the blog active and hopefully attract some more people to the website. 13 quotes by Thomas Sowell which obliterate progressivism. Yeah, this was just a blog post, not a article analysis, but these were 13 red pill moments that I thought people would really appreciate from Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, killer. Well, I guess before we go through that, how have you been, man?
I've been very well. The main thing I focus on is promoting the Voluntarist Handbook, going on podcasts, was on Monica Perez's show, was on Kyle Anzalone's show, Tom Woods, Dave Smith, James Corbett. Very fortunate for those guys to have me on. Basically, it's a collection of 50 essays from 1850 to 2021. These are what I think make the bulletproof case for libertarianism, voluntarism, anarcho-capitalism, coming to the same conclusion from tons of different starting places. So chapter 50 is just a bunch of miscellaneous quotes that I have come across that I really think convey the importance of the idea of freedom, hopefully to people from progressive upbringings to conservative as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I realized just now that I haven't had you on the show since you dropped the book. I did a plug for it. It was like not a full episode of the podcast, but I did a plug of it where I read the essay that you were gracious enough to include in the book about the central banking scam. And so that was really cool for me to see that in print. So really appreciate that.
Oh, yes. I'm getting great feedback. I know a lot of people don't like Amazon. You can always get a free PDF from the Libertarian Institute on the book page. You can also purchase it at barnesandnoble.com.
So those are the places to get it. It would be like libertarianinstitute.org and then click on the Voluntarist Handbook.
Correct. And Barnes and Noble and Amazon.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, let's dive into these quotes here. And I think you want to just take one at a time, and I'll take the first one, and then we can discuss like we usually do.
One at a time. I'm ready.
Yeah. So the very same people who say that government has no right to interfere with sexual activity between consenting adults believe that the government has every right to interfere with economic activity between consenting adults. That's from his article. Oh, no, it's from the Sun Sentinel in January 2000, looking for that elusive escalator to success. And so really what we're seeing here is the thing that libertarianism provides, which is an obsession with consent. And if you apply consent or the concept of consent equally, you find that there is no other political ideology that is equally applies this theory of consent, right? The conservatives would want to interfere with sexual activity between consenting adults, and liberals would want to interfere with economic activity between consenting adults. So anything to add on that, Keith?
Not much. I just love this practice of taking something that people already believe in and then extending it, as opposed to, hey, ditch your current identity and embrace ours. that is an extremely high mountain to ask people to climb. But if you just take something they already believe in and say, well, why do you support sexual activity between consenting adults? What if they get AIDS? What if they have too many kids and there's a population problem? What if, insert disaster? That is the same exact thing they do with the justification for government supremacy and coercively controlling economic activities between consenting adults. Once you realize there's no principal difference, you can never be fooled by the cult of statism again.
This is one thing that I greatly appreciate about being a libertarian, because I was having a conversation with a friend's dad. So my buddy, he has this tiki bar in his backyard that he built out of a garden shed, or it looks like a garden shed, but he built this bar in the backyard, and that's where we go and hang out on Friday nights. And so his dad came over one time a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about the war in Ukraine and things like that, but also talking about the cops. And he's a big progressive. And one thing that I really like is that I can find common ground with anyone being a libertarian and caring about the non-aggression principle, because there's these single issue coalitions that we can build from almost any standpoint. And in this situation, we were able to, have a long conversation talking about the police and drug legalization and things like that. But then things, were different when we disagreed on another subject, which is fine. It was a wonderful conversation. But that's one thing I really enjoy in messaging with our position. So
absolutely.
Keith, the next quote here.
In reality, most of the great fortunes in American history have resulted from someone figuring out how to reduce costs so as to be able to charge lower prices and therefore gain a mass market for the product. Henry Ford did this with automobiles, Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, and Sears, Penny, and Walton of Walmart, and other department store chain founders with a variety of products. Other people to mention in that, what could be an updated version, are Steve Jobs with computers and smartphones, Jeff Bezos with access to books, giving the average proletariat more institutional power than they could ever imagine, Silicon Valley giving us access to a lot of free social media material. So this myth that if something's privatized, they of course use that word, meaning there's the state of nature and then the rich privatize it and take it over. When something's done peacefully and voluntarily based on contract, there is a built-in incentive to meet the needs of the masses, harmonizing individual profit incentive and the well-being of society as a whole. So this is just a complete myth that in the private sector, they only care about the rich and they only benefit themselves at the expense of others. That actually is the correct criticism of government.
And I think it's interesting because you mentioned you went on James Corbett's show and talked about the Voluntary's Handbook. There's always this fine line with being someone who is a fan of free market capitalism, but also looking at the history of the robber barons, as it would be called in progressive media, or progressive history, because there are things about the Rockefellers and Carnegies and Sears and Penny, the Waltons, that from a libertarian standpoint, we don't like, in terms of rent-seeking behavior and getting grants from the government for things like that. So it's how do you, Keith, deal with this kind of walking the razor's edge?
Well, all you have to do is take the criticism and apply it to the other side of the equation. So when they say, well, there's greedy people like Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, Jeff Bezos. Yeah, there are greedy people in every society. The thing about the free market is it channels that greed in such a way to where they can't get a penny out of our pockets unless they create value for us in exchange. What they can do is use government. The biggest example with Carnegie would be the drastic expansion of state educational programs to get people into being sort of robotic workers. This is something the Ford Foundation also does. Big statists at the Ford Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation also has big statists. Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, of course, advocates big government, but the average person also advocates big government. The difference is these people have a lot of power. So the solution is to recognize greed is a universal. The follow-up question is, what set of rules makes it so this greed that will always exist can be channeled in the most effective way.
And the reason I mentioned Corbett specifically is because of it, like, his big oil series and the work that he's done on the Rockefellers and them getting involved in the medical industry and kind of taking that over. But you're right. I mean, it's like, for instance, the antitrust lawsuits. What it looked like the government was attacking Rockefeller, but in actuality, didn't he gain a whole bunch of, capital through the antitrust process? And so
his net wealth increased afterwards. They basically diversified his portfolio for him. That was their brilliant approach to this. The bottom line is there's greedy people out there. Make sure that they can't get a penny out of your pocket unless you voluntarily give it to them, or a second of your time unless you choose to associate with them. And the only the people that really understand that are libertarians.
So the next quote is, competition does a much more effective job than government at protecting customers. So for a time, I was a personal injury lawyer where I would take some or work on some products liability cases. And in my opinion, when you have in a free market society, you would have personal injury attorneys doing much of the job that the government would in terms of regulating industries. So you would have a lot more active plaintiff's bar, in my opinion. But then at the root of that, what you actually have is you're still using the arm of government to regulate an industry, because when you have a civil suit, you're asking the government to find a judgment against someone else that would, in a sense, coercively apply some kind of a lien on property or create a judgment that needs to be paid. So you're kind of stepping in with this threat. But the difference here being is that when you litigate in the courts, what you're really trying to do is prove a property rights violation, right? Because it's like, well, you sold me a product that placed me at an unacceptable or unreasonable risk of damaging my property, my body. And so in terms of like that, my free market solution would be the plaintiff's bar in like products liability actions. But of course, I know what Thomas Sowell is talking about here. It's like, okay, well, if Acme Corporation sells a log splitter that accidentally chops people's hands off, then they're going to hear about that, and they're probably not going to buy Acme log splitters anymore. And you hear about these things in the press all the time, recalls, or, we had Graco built like a stroller, or some other company. I don't want to get sued, but some company buys this or builds a stroller that amputates the fingers off of toddlers because their fingers get caught in the spokes of the thing. People aren't going to buy that anymore. So any thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, and notice he says much more effective job. He doesn't say in the free market, things are perfect.
Yeah.
So the idea that, look, people died in this fire and under these horrible conditions. Well, has anyone ever died working for the government? I mean, have military members ever died fighting in a war? Has that ever occurred? The example that Sowell uses in this is look at the number of on-the-job deaths before and after OSHA. You see a drastic decrease long before OSHA ever comes around, because safety is something people actually value. So you have to pay more or provide better working conditions to attract workers, which gets you your money. Another way the free market is able to harmonize interests. So all government does with things like the FDA is provide a coercively funded monopoly on saying what is allowed to be sold and what is not allowed to be sold. All the shortcomings with that are the same shortcomings that would come with only the Catholic Church tells us what we can read. So when only the FDA tells us what food's allowed to go in our stomach, well, that violates the my body, my choice principle that we're always getting nagged about. And second, they don't have an incentive to make sure a large number of products and services get to market. So there's all these terrible things that are associated with it, and it's immoral. Competition just allows you to at least disassociate with the bad actors in the world, whereas government doesn't.
All right. The next quote is yours.
The number of blacks in professional, technical, and other high-level occupations more than doubled in the decade preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other occupations, gains by blacks were greater during the 1940s, when there was practically no civil rights legislation. Then, during the 1950s, in various skill trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. Affirmative action hiring pressures make it costly to have no minority employees, but continuing affirmative action pressures at the promotion and discharge phases also make it costly to have minority employees who do not work out well. The net effect is to increase the demand for highly qualified minority employees while decreasing the demand for less qualified minority employees or those without a sufficient track record to reassure employers. In short, mandating the hiring of blacks, women, insert any demographic, all it does is bid up the prices for people who are already highly skilled in those areas. It makes it much harder for people who don't work out, who have lower skills, who have much less on-the-job experience. So it helps. But what he's saying here is that it helps highly skilled, wealthy blacks at the expense of poorer, less skilled blacks. So we should feel no intimidation about explicitly opposing affirmative action.
One thing that I think is really funny, Keith, is in 1999, Justin Raimondo came out with an article called China and the New Cold War. And this is an article that I went through on the show a couple episodes ago. But he talks about the myth of Red China, because, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you know, China, the Chinese Communist Party, China is communist, all this stuff. But in reality, if you actually look at the economic policies in China, it's no more communist or socialist than the United States is. And one thing he specifically cites, Raimondo does, is he says, well, there is no Chinese Civil Rights Act and there is no Chinese with Disabilities Act or anything like that. So I just think that's funny.
Yeah, Ronald Coase wrote a whole book about this, about China in 1979 turning around, India in 1991. It's very common. Any place that embraces free market policies becomes much wealthier immediately.
And you've seen that picture of Shanghai that was taken in the 70s versus, or it was like Shanghai in the 50s versus Shanghai in the 2000s. And one is just like basically a field, and the other one is like a gigantic metropolitan area.
You know what? No, I've seen the Singapore and Hong Kong examples. I got to check that one out to add it to the list.
I just want to make sure it's Shanghai, because it could be Hong Kong or Singapore or something. I think it was a Chinese city. So if the listeners, I'll put a link in the show notes page for that, just to get the right one. So libertyweekly.net/234. Yeah, 234. Okay, so the University of Michigan study found, here's the next quote, that among working Americans who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975, approximately 95% had risen out of that bracket by 1991, including 29% who had reached the top quintile by 1991, compared to only 5% who still remained in the bottom quintile. The IRS found that between 1996 and 2005, the income of individuals who had been in the bottom 20% of income tax filers in 1996 had increased by 91% by 2005, and the income of those individuals who were in the top 1% in 1996 had fallen by 26%. Even among the truly rich, there is turnover. When Forbes magazine ran its Hearst list of the 400 richest Americans in 1982, that list included 14 Rockefellers, 28 DuPonts, and 11 Hunts. 20 years later, the list included 3 Rockefellers, 1 Hunt, and no DuPonts. Over 1/5 of the people on the 1982 Forbes list of the wealthiest Americans inherited their wealth. By 2006, however, only 2% of the people on the list had inherited their wealth. When the incomes of people making $50,000 or less fell by 2% between 2007 and 2009, the incomes of people making $1 million or more fell by nearly 50%. So I think this really speaks for itself in terms of the mobility that still exists in the United States, despite much progressive and interventionist economic policy. Any thoughts there, Keith?
This is what I love about Sowell, how he brings the empiricism to the theories of both left and right status, who will say, well, under the free market, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it's as a result of the free market. There's all this intergenerational wealth where there's exploitation in the 1600s under feudalism. And that's basically, it's all been inherited up until this day. They have no account for how new wealth is created. And then they say, well, this is the inherent inequality. Well, inequality exists in every other system. It's not like Joe Biden and I are real equal when it comes to our amount of power, or the amount of power the average North Korean has with Kim Jong-un, or President Xi with the average person in China, or insert any other, political inequality that exists everywhere. And then finally, he is changing the metric by which they make this judgment. So what they will often do is say the bottom 25% earn X, and then years later, they still earned X. What they don't account for is that they're talking about different individuals over a wider range of time. The example that Sowell uses is, imagine you go to a high school and you find out that 25% of the students are freshmen and 25% are seniors. You then come back 20 years later and still 25% are freshmen and 25% are seniors. Therefore, no one ages in this town because of these percentages. Yeah. What you're leaving out is the freshmen today aren't the same freshmen of 50 years ago. The people earning $20,000 today, back then, have a lot more skills today, and those individuals have increased in income. That's how you measure income mobility, not this ridiculous bottom quintile nonsense. So this is everything about what I love about Sowell.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It feels like, when, I don't know, if you go on like these incredible, crazy conspiracy theory things, I'm not talking about real conspiracy. I'm talking about crazy ones. And it's like people make all these different allegations, and some of the facts and data they put out there is really compelling. But then you look into it, or someone like comes and explains it all and gives a completely sense-making, mundane explanation. And then you're like, oh yeah, that sounds right. Yes. And it's like, that's what Sowell does with these quotes. So
yeah, and that might have been where I learned the Russiagate response of Donald Trump has business ties with Russia. Goes, yes, he does. He has more ties with Bangladesh. Now, is there Bangladeshi interference? Because that's where all his ties were made since forever. So yeah, Sowell is great.
Hey everybody, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. It is at my new membership website, libertyweekly.club. And I know I've been announcing this, but I left Substack, rolled out a new membership website that operates the same way. You get content through your email address, but there's also a webpage, libertyweekly.club, where you can go and read the articles. And it works really great so far. Just a couple of hiccups in terms of trying to figure out how to use, free previews for people who are just signed up to the free newsletter. And for people who sign up through the membership here, you can see that right now I have a $5 a month tier that will get you access to early access to episodes of Liberty Weekly, access to bonus episodes that I've been trying to come out with 2 times a month. Preprint access to all my Libertarian Institute articles before they're published. And I'm working on setting up a subscribers only live stream. I'd like to do that before the end of the month, which I will announce through the email list. So if you go through, sign up for the email list, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button. You can choose the free tier, or you could choose the $5 per month tier, which will get you access to the benefits. But for free content, there still is free content up there. Like I do a lot of article content there. So head on over to libertyweekly.club. The other thing that I'm really excited to announce is a collaboration between myself and Ludwig von Mises Pieces, which is the guy who does all my graphics and thumbnails, and the guy who, he does a ton of awesome work. So you can see Liberty Weekly merch is now available if you head on over to libertyweekly.net this time /merch, MERCH, you'll be able to find Liberty Weekly merch with my new logo with the rising sun and Lady Liberty holding the shield and flag. I really like the logo that he was able to do for me. And you can see that you can get coffee mugs there. You can get sweatshirt. You can get t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. The other collaboration. Oh, and if you use promo code LW10, that will get you 10% off. And it will also get a kickback to me and show him that you bought through my link. But you could also go through all the other merchandise that he has there. There's lots of good stuff. You buy anything in the store with promo code LW10, and I will also get a kickback. You can see a bunch of stickers and t-shirts and designs that people in our sphere of the Liberty movement will just love all that, the merch that he has there. It's original stuff that he's made himself. And we did a collaboration on a t-shirt, that idea that I had, Dissolve NATO, super timely right now. But for those of you just listening to the audio version only, it's the NATO logo that is being shattered into a million pieces, and it says Dissolve NATO on it. So I think it's a really cool, timely t-shirt. Of course, it was an idea that I'd commissioned, and I think that he did an awesome job with it. And if you like my thumbnails and logo art, Ludwig von Mises Pieces did Why I Am Anti-War podcast logo, which is a dove coming out of a helmet. And I really, really like that logo too. So check out this Dissolve NATO. You can get it in sticker format. You can get it on a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. And I'm going to be picking some of these up myself because I think they turned out really awesome. So again, head on over to libertyweekly.net /merch. And to get the NATO t-shirt, head on over to libertyweekly.net /NATO, NATO. All right. So that's all the stuff I got for you guys this week. Thanks everyone for subscribing, all the members at libertyweekly.club. Really appreciate it. You really help me afford all the hosting costs and to upgrade my equipment and all that kind of stuff too. So, all right. Thanks. Peace. One of the great non sequiturs of the left is that if the free market doesn't work perfectly, then it doesn't work at all, and the government should step in. So I'll do the next one too, because they're a little bit joined. But the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. So that one makes me laugh a lot because it also makes me think of Hans Hoppe's explanation. I think it's a theory of socialism and capitalism, where he talks about just in the beginning there how scarcity would exist even in the Garden of Eden, where everything is just at an arm's reach away, where you could pluck fruit off a tree. Do that with Star Trek, where you can conjure up anything that you want, just put it in the microwave, or what is it, like a atom materializer or something like that. And the reason for that is because time itself is a scarce resource. And so no two people can occupy my consciousness and body at the same time. It's just an impossibility. And for the first one, if the free market doesn't work perfectly, then it doesn't work at all. And the government should therefore step in. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Is that in products liability case, competition, free market competition will ensure the more safe product or the most safe work conditions. And that doesn't mean that people aren't going to be hurt by products. It means just on the whole that in a free market situation, competition creates safer products. So anything else?
Could not have said it better myself. Next one. The reason so many people misunderstand so many issues is not that these issues are so complex, but that people do not want a factual or analytical explanation that leaves them emotionally unsatisfied. They want villains to hate and heroes to cheer, and they don't want explanations that don't give them that. That is so important for us to appreciate, that when someone actually believes that a woman and a man do the same work, provide the same value, and the woman gets paid like 60 cents on the dollar or whatever the most recent lie is, you have to not put any thought into that to believe something so ridiculous. So when they're met with counterexamples of, do you know that doesn't account for the number of hours worked, or what types of jobs they work, or the amount of skills, or the amount of seniority in employment, or asking for promotions, they respond so emotionally. They don't go, oh, thank God, I thought we lived in a sexist hellhole. I'm against sexism, so that's a big relief. Thank you. They get so pissed off at you. So what we need to appreciate is that we can always find the good in people's heroes. On the right, I love talking about Pat Buchanan because so much of what the right is really good on, Pat Buchanan perfectly personifies that, not to mention people like Frederick Douglass. On the left, people like Jimmy Dore, Tulsi Gabbard, if you would consider Tulsi, somewhat on the left. It's like all the Democrats hate her. But Jimmy Dore is someone I can frequently reference and say, look, Jimmy Dore agrees with us on this. Can't you see that, this is something at least worthy of your attention? So it's really important that we give people heroes to like and villains to hate, especially villains. Say, you know what? We don't think the world is some perfect utopia. We hate Richard Haas and Karl Rove and Dick Cheney because they're the biggest violators of the non-aggression principle in murdering people, worse than enslaving them. What we're doing is as important as the abolitionist movement because we're talking about mass murder campaigns. So, giving people villains to hate, I think, is really important.
Yeah, there's a big, one thing I've heard you and Scott talk about lately is it social psychology? Did you guys? The term is social proof. That just means the number of people who believe things, you assume it's much more likely to be true than not true. Yeah. All right. Well, the next quote here, what all these moral crusades have in common is their moral exaltation of the anointed above others, who are to have their very different views nullified and superseded by the views of the anointed, imposed via the power of government. Despite the great variety of issues and a series of crusading movements among the intelligentsia during the 20th century, several key elements have been common to most of them. One, assertions of a great danger to the whole of society, a danger to which the masses of people are oblivious, an urgent need for action to avert impending catastrophe, a need for government to drastically curtail the dangerous behavior of the many in response to the prescient conclusions of the few, a disdainful dismissal of arguments to the contrary as either uninformed, irresponsible, or motivated by unworthy purposes. Now, this seems to me to be problem, reaction, solution.
Yeah. Look, the year he wrote this was in 1995, and it perfectly fits the war on terrorism scam, which people now, people don't even defend Afghanistan because the Taliban took over in 11 days after the U.S. was there for 20 years, let alone Iraq, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Mali. They're not even aware about a number of those. But at the time, it was this great danger to society, which the masses really don't understand. That's why lying to them is okay. An urgent need for action. Well, we don't want the news of their WMDs to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. They have to curtail freedoms in the name of the Patriot Act and disdainful dismissal. You're just a terrorist sympathizer. You hate America. And then run those four criteria through the COVID regime. There's a great illness that's going to kill tons of people. That we need to drastically increase government power and spending. There's a dismissal of calling anyone a conspiracy theorist or a COVID denier. Same thing with climate change. Sowell saw this in 1995. He had such a good understanding of it.
Next one, the most basic question is not what is best, but who shall decide what is best.
I just love that this one differentiates between what people of goodwill really want with the source of where they disagree. Most of us want everyone to have good health care. But people on our side say yes, and we believe the best way to do that is not to have politicians or people who bear no cost for being wrong, but people who actually have an incentive to provide you with a good product or service. We believe competition will give you more options and higher quality than you otherwise would. So it's not that we're against, good education. We just don't trust teachers who have no incentive to provide a good product.
The next one's here. Voluntary economic transactions, whether between employer and employee, tenant and landlord, or international trade, would not continue to take place unless both parties were better off making these transactions than not making them. Eventually, however, the fact that many once poor places like Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore achieved prosperity through freer international trade and investment became so blatant and so widely known that by the end of the 20th century, the governments of many other countries began abandoning their zero-sum view of economic transactions. China and India have been striking examples of poor countries whose abandonment of severe international trade and investment restrictions led to dramatic increases in their economic growth rates, which in turn led to tens of millions of their citizens rising out of poverty. Another way of looking at this is that the zero-sum fallacy had kept millions of very poor people needlessly mired in poverty for generations before such notions were abandoned. So I guess one question I have, Keith, is was Sowell known more so as being a conservative and not a libertarian?
No, he was publicly known as a conservative, but anytime he would be asked, he would strictly say, I'm a libertarian who disagrees with them on foreign policy. So they did the same thing with Walter Williams. New York Times called him a conservative in the headline and a libertarian in the very last paragraph.
Interesting. So he said, I'm a libertarian, but I disagree with libertarians on foreign policy? Unequivocally,
yes, all the time.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, so I guess one reason why I asked that question is because I've talked and I've done a little bit of writing about the paleo conservative kind of alliance between Mises libertarians in the in the early 90s, and Justin Raimondo supported Pat Buchanan. But Pat, the one hang up always was his protectionist trade policy, especially in regard to China. And so it's interesting that, on the one hand, Pat Buchanan would be really pretty good, very good on foreign policy, but be bad on protectionism, where Thomas Sowell would be bad on foreign policy, but good on protectionism.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, next one.
Innumerable studies. You know what? I had just given this speech. This is him making the empirical evidence for the against the gender pay gap. So we can skip that one. I don't want to beat that to death.
Yeah.
Long story short, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to oranges. Okay, here's Thomas Sowell from Economic Facts and Fallacies. For centuries before, Europeans had enslaved other Europeans, Asians had enslaved other Asians, and Africans had enslaved other Africans. In the modern era, only in the modern era was there both the wealth and technology to organize the mass transportation of people across an ocean, either as slaves or as free immigrants. Nor were Europeans the only ones to transport masses of enslaved human beings from one continent to another. North Africa's Barbary Coast pirates alone captured and enslaved at least 1 million Europeans from 1500 to 1800. Carrying more Europeans into bondage in North Africa than were Africans brought in bondage to the United States and to the American colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, Europeans were still being bought and sold in the slave markets of the Islamic world decades after blacks were freed in the United States. Slavery was a virtually universal institution in countries around the world and for thousands of years of recorded history. Indeed, archaeological evidence suggests that human beings learned to enslave other human beings before they learned to write. One of the many fallacies about slavery, that it was based on race, is sustained by the simple but pervasive practice of focusing exclusively on the enslavement of Africans by Europeans as if this were something unique rather than part of a much larger worldwide human tragedy. Racism grew out of slavery, especially in the United States, African slavery in the United States, but slavery preceded racism by thousands of years. Europeans enslaved other Europeans for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. All that is so vitally important. So people recognize the problem with slavery is not whites or America or capitalism. The problem with slavery is initiating violence against peaceful people.
Yep. And that goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the episode, where libertarianism is a political philosophy that's hyper concerned about consent. So this makes me think of, all the people who have been slaves traditionally that have been left out, like the Irish. Or I read something or heard something about slavery occurring in the Caucasus regions, like around Russia and in Ukraine. And there's a bit of history with white slavery there. But it made me think of I don't know if you've seen the Rings of Power, and hopefully you haven't, because it's a woke piece of trash. But they have these hobbit-like creatures that are called Harfoots, and basically it's a racist caricature of Irish people. Like they went so woke that they went like the other direction and wanted to create this whimsical race of like hobbit-like people, but it just turned out to be like the worst like stereotype of Irish people. Like I won't even go through it because it'll be taken out of context. But anyways, just a funny thing. We got like 3 minutes left here, Keith. The last quote is, "What is called planning in political rhetoric is the government's suppression of other people's plans by superimposing on them a collective plan created by third parties armed with the power of government and exempted from paying the costs that these collective plans impose on others." So any thoughts on that last quote?
Exactly. It's not that the distinction is there's a plan and then there's no plan. That's a false dichotomy. The question is, who is going to do the planning? Government bureaucrats who get coercive funding and don't pay a price for being wrong, or people who are directly involved in these interactions voluntarily, whose reputation is based on whether or not they succeed or fail, and who face a financial penalty if they don't meet employer demand, consumer demand, coworker demand, etc. And just one final thing. The slavery of military conscription, I think, has to be the worst of all. That's why it's so important that we don't blindly take the side of Zelensky and his regime in Ukraine, because they are practicing military slavery, the worst form of forced labor that's more likely to get you killed than cotton picking ever has. They're both evil and they're both terrible, but it's important that we don't just say forced cotton picking's bad. Yeah, we all know that's not a big dispute today. Today, men still have to register for military conscription in America and in tons of places around the world.
All right. So any thoughts on the last episode of Liberty Weekly? You've been here since we met in like episode 40 or something like that. You invited me on your show and you did like I got to put that first video in the show notes page, because
hide it in the Library of Congress where no one will ever find it.
We did like a role play where I was the progressive,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I titled it Libertarianism versus Conservatism versus Progressivism or something like that.
Yeah, that's I think it's like libertyweekly.net/42 or something.
Dude, I just love hearing all the different arguments against from so many different people. Yeah. That was funny. I'll have to get a few drinks in me before I ever watch that one again.
Okay.
But dude, congrats on Liberty Weekly. I look forward to Vital Dissent.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, man. All right. libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find Keith's work, and we are out of time. Thanks, Keith.
Yep.